I remember having this conversation one time. I think we were driving back from Stanford, and David and a few other people in this band we were in. And I think David might have said that when we were talking about theater and what we were doing in terms of Asian American themes, wouldn't it be funny if one day people studied us? I still remember that, because that would have been beyond our wildest dreams to have thought that at that time.
Hi, I'm Todd London. I'm the project director of the Legacy Playwrights Initiative, housed at the Dramatists Guild Foundation. Welcome to our series of interviews with the Legacy honorees. These are playwrights who have made enormous impact on the professional theater in America and often beyond. They are our senior artists in the field, and we're using this series to hear from them, to hear about how they started, what they're doing now, and what their legacy means to them and how they hope to pass it on. Thank you for joining us. It is my absolute pleasure to interview Philip Gotanda in his home school of the University of California, Berkeley.
On the Durham stage.
Okay, so tell us about where we are. Where are we?
We're in the Durham studio stage at UC Berkeley.
Yeah.
And this theater had Gregory Peck on the stage here. Gregory Peck went to UC Berkeley, studied theater, and he, the rumor is, the myth is that he acted on the stage.
So that would have been 1940s, maybe?
I think, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So you are here, and Philip, first of all, congratulations on being one of the first of the Legacy Playwrights. It was you, the late Ed Bullens, who passed in the first year after Constance Congdon, Connie, and then this past year, Carlisle Brown and Milcha Sanchez Scott. I want to start by getting a sense of your beginnings. I've known you for a long time, but one of the things that I'm constantly impressed by is you are a playwright, you are a master playwright and an important playwright, and you are also many other things. You're really a Renaissance man, a musician, a filmmaker, a performer, playwright, a professor here at UC Berkeley. So how did the writing start? What's the origin story of Philip the playwright?
I'm from Stockton, California, which is in the San Joaquin Valley near here. And it was a home to a very large Japanese American population. Now, that population were all incarcerated during the World War II. So it meant my family, my extended family, everybody in the community whom my parents were part of were all sent to Aurora, Arkansas, and imprisoned there, incarcerated. 2 years after that, 3 years after that, they come back to Stockton, my parents. They had 3 sons. I was the youngest. So I grew up in Stockton in the 50s and 60s after they had, and the whole community, my family, all my relatives had come back from being basically imprisoned by the U.S. government for several years. I grew up with that kind of I don't even know how to call it, but that was sort of in the ethos. It just was always floating around. I didn't know how to articulate it because no one talked about it. So I grew up in Stockton in the 50s and 60s, strong interest in the arts, and also aware that I didn't have a voice that was mine. At that time period, the idea of a face like this just didn't exist. So I might have wanted to write about, I did this, my characters did this, and they were based all on my family. I didn't know how to do it. So at that time, I went off to college, UC Santa Cruz.
Okay.
Very experimental. Too experimental.
Known as the hippie school at the time, in the Redwoods.
In the Redwoods. I was only like about 4 years old at that time.
Okay.
And I went there, and it was also at the same time and coincident with the emergence of the Asian American movement. So I arrived at a time at UC Santa Cruz in 1969. The Asian American movement had begun The term was coined Asian American in 1968 by a friend of mine, Yuji Ichioka, professor. And so with that came this whole cultural movement that was also part of the political movement. And one aspect of that was theater. Now, what I found at that point was that I finally had some way to understand all my experiences I had growing up through Stockton. It finally gave me sort of a face and a body to center in the storytelling. And it was because of that movement and my interest in the arts that together they finally afforded me a chance to begin to create things. And so from that point on, I felt I had a voice, I had a political kind of context to shape it and inform it. And so I began writing songs. Not theater yet.
Right.
Because one of the things is theater is a part of, and a very important part of my sort of artistic legacy. And it isn't the only thing that I turn to be able to kind of tell these stories. So initially, I wrote songs and sang songs and performed them at Asian American events at universities for the various Asian American departments. And I also teamed up with a friend of mine, David Henry Wong, who was going to Stanford at that time and just about to write or had written his first play, FOB. But we met, we were introduced through a man who ran East-West Players, Mako.
Yes.
I had written my first play that was Asian American, and it was a musical. So I was in LA in a rehearsal room, and there was a knock at the door. And I opened it, and David was there. And he said, Mako told me to come on over here, that I should meet you, because I do music too. He had a violin.
Wow.
And
he's a few years younger.
Yes, he is.
Yeah. So
he was still at Stanford at that time, I think he was. And so we started to jam. He took out his violin. And what people don't know is...
And you were playing the guitar?
I played the guitar, sang and wrote songs, and he played the violin, and he's a really talented jazz violinist. And I think he really admires Jean Ponty. And we jammed, and we thought, let's do something together. So kind of out of that, kind of the Asian American forces sort of through the arts, bringing us together, we started singing and performing together.
Yeah.
You know, and we did a lot of original songs about being Asian American. That carried forth, and while that was going on, I was trying to make a career out of it. You know,
out of the music.
Out of the music and singing and performing.
The play was just something you had done. The play you had written,
the play I had
given
written
to Mako. Yeah.
Was something I had done, and I was going to follow up on it. At the same time, I was trying to make a career as a singer-songwriter, writing songs about being Asian American, my Asian American soul. So you can imagine the market that was hungry for it. They're hungry for it, and
probably was a hungry market, but it didn't know it was a market yet.
Yeah. And how to reach it. So so I ended up, I was playing my songs and singing, and I was playing in North Beach at open mic night. Open mic night that you get your chance.
Were you playing as Philip Gotanda or as Joe Ozu?
Philip Gotanda.
Okay.
Singing my original songs, and I was already beginning to question whether I could make a career out of singing these types of songs that had to do with being Asian American. So I was singing my yellow soul out, and no one was paying attention. These open mic things that people are drinking, chatting, and I was looking out, getting pretty discouraged, thinking, I've done this for about a year now.
Yeah.
I do my gigs that I go to. David and I do these variety of things, but also I'd like to do it kind of professionally too. So I was pretty discouraged. And so in the midst of that set, a stripper came in from next door. North Beach, San Francisco, this is in the 70s. She strolled in, and then as I was singing my songs, singing my heart out, she came in and strolled through the aisles, and she was dancing to my music. And as she reached the front of the stage, she turned around and started just dancing to my music. And of course, the whole house paid attention.
Right.
And so she was dancing, I was singing, these songs about being Asian American, which are like, very close to my heart.
Yeah.
And she was dancing, people were hooting and hollering, and I thought, this is a better way to make a living. This is really truly up, and I thought, and so I went back to law school. So I don't know if I mentioned it before, but I went to law school
I
for,
forgot that.
and got a law degree.
So you're
And
trying to leave the music behind and become a lawyer, or you were just trying to subsidize the music?
I was trying to leave music behind because it just wasn't fulfilling me in any way. So I became a lawyer. And the idea was that with law, you could really do something, socially responsible. You can kind of impact the world. Well, I was there for the third year. I was really bored, and I got my guitar and I wrote songs, and I thought, I'll write a musical. So I wrote the musical, and as I was studying for the bar, I got a phone call out of nowhere, really, and said, Philip, we came across your tape of your musical, and we'd like to do it. And I thought, I had no experience with theater. I certainly wasn't even aware of that theater company that well. And
What was the company?
East West
Oh,
Players.
this was East West. This is Mako's company.
Yeah, and he said, we'd like to do the play, a musical. And I said, wow, this is rather interesting. Can you come down and we chat about it? So I got in my car, drove straight down to LA. I met them all, and I sang the entire musical for them on the spot. And they said, let's do it. I said, hey, this is great. The world has not said yes to me yet.
Wow.
And so I said, fine, let's do it. And they said, but we want to do it right away. We want to open our season with it. And I thought, well, I'm studying for the bar. And they said, well, if you want to do it, you come down. Choice is yours. So I decided, you know what? I'm going to do the musical. So I didn't take the bar. I got my degree, my JD, but didn't take the bar. And I did the play, and I had no
And you
experience.
had composed the musical as well as written it?
Yeah.
Okay. What was it called?
The Avocado Kid, or Zen in the Art of Guacamole. Again, this was the 70s,
Yes.
So it did well, and they asked me to write another one. And so I thought, I'm figuring out how to write a play, because I hadn't worked in theater. And I wrote another one, less music, and then it gave me a whole career path.
Wow.
And along with that, around that time too, I met David. We started doing these gigs together.
Yeah.
And that was also part of the musical journey. And David went off to do his plays, his operas, on and on.
Yeah.
And then I continued working in theater.
Never took your bar?
Never took the bar.
Okay.
But it allowed me to return to some things which I really loved. I started making films.
Right away, early.
Well, about 7 or 8 years after that,
Okay.
I think I started. I'd always loved film, and I've been trying to get these grants to do a film, and the funders would always say, you're a playwright, not a filmmaker. So I said, okay. So I decided I was going to make my film anyway, and I needed money. So I had been courting these people that would come to my plays, and I would say to them, one day I'm going to come to you and ask you for money to do a project, okay? So if you like what I'm doing now, then remember that. And so at that point I said, I'm ready to ask someone. So I went to, he's a strawberry king, and they call him Mr. Strawberry,
Okay.
a Japanese-American farmer.
From the Stockton area? From the...
No, he's more from Camarillo.
Okay.
But he had been coming to my plays both in LA, and mainly in Los Angeles. And so he gave me the money. I prepped, got ready to make my first film. I knew nothing about filmmaking again. I decided to make a 13-minute film to sort of get my hands kind of used to dip them in the waters. And I decided, since I was known as a playwright, I'd do a play with few words. And I was a fan of Jacques Tati. And so I used that as the model. And the week before we started filming, my actor said he couldn't do it. And so my wife said, why don't you do it? So I said, we have no choice. So I played the central
This
role.
is your first performance? Had you ever performed before?
No acting at all.
Okay.
It's called The Kiss, and it's based on a very interesting experience I had. We won't go into it now, but the film went to Sundance, and then it went to the Berlin International Film Festival. It got accepted to all these places, and it was sort of like, I'm a filmmaker now. I wasn't before. And so I began to make films, and the idea was to make a feature. So I met the 13-minute, and I made a half-an-hour film that was quite successful, went to Sundance, was shown on KQED, and then finally I was ready to do my feature. So this was over a period of 10 years.
Yeah.
And I made Life Tastes Good, feature film, went to Sundance, and so that was my film thing. At the same time, I was doing plays.
So you're writing plays, the music is still going on, you become a filmmaker.
Yes.
And a performer.
Yeah.
None of this have you trained for.
No.
The first play of yours that I saw, I saw on television as part of American Playhouse, I believe.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
called The Wash.
Yes.
So my assumption is that is about your family?
No.
Oh, it was not. Will you talk about The Wash? Because that was a big national moment. When that was, how it falls in this trajectory.
It was early in my playwriting career. I think it was the fourth play I wrote. And I've always had this strong attraction to, at that time I was quite young, but elderly people. I've always been fascinated by them. So I decided to write this story. It was a play initially. And it's about, an elderly couple where the woman leaves the man. She takes on a lover. The man himself also finds another lover and has an affair. Then the original husband finds out, goes after and threatens to kill the couple's wife and her new beau, and they finally ultimately work it out. But it's about changing sort of generationally how one generation, these men, cannot adapt to the way the world is changing, and his wife outgrows him. And the whole image is of laundry, where in the beginning, Mossy comes in and has a bag of laundry. They've already separated, and she picks up all the old laundry off the floor, puts them into a bag, and delivers the new laundry all washed. And then she walks out and says, "I'm going now," and she leaves. At the end of the play, after they've gone through everything, she comes in again. He's sitting there, not talking, in front of the television, and much has happened. And then she comes in and she picks up all the old clothes, puts it in a bag, and she starts to walk towards the door. And then she stops. And she looks back, and she brings the clothes back and leaves them, and then just kind of goes out the door. So it was the play initially. It was done all over. And then it was made into a feature film through American Playhouse. And it actually had a theatrical release. It's one of the first, I think, sort of Asian American family plays.
Yeah.
And so that's how it became a feature film.
So first, there's a lot of firsts here, and there's a lot of serendipity of meeting this important, probably the preeminent artistic director, Asian American artistic director, Mako, at this seminal theater, East West Players, meeting the future David Henry Hwang, playing music. And I'm really interested because we're in a conversation about legacy and being at the start of a movement, as you even described it, even just the term Asian American was new. Who were your fellow travelers? Who were your other fellow travelers? Did you have influences? Were there other playwrights who you looked to, or were you all just making it up as you went?
A combination of both. The thing about being a playwright is, at that time, everyone wanted to be an actor. So at the various theaters that existed at that time, there was East West Players in LA, Asian American Theater Workshop in San Francisco, Pan Asian Rep in New York, and Northwest Asian American Theater Company in Seattle, run by Beulah Kuo, Tisa Chang, Mako, and Frank Chin in San Francisco. So at that time, there weren't, it was the beginnings, actually the second wave in terms of Asian American theater. I came in as a writer, and everything I wrote went up because, again, everyone wanted to be an actor, and that was fine. And so I trained and learned on my feet because everything I wrote went up. Also, again, it was the idea that the movement and cultural movement in Asian American theater was emergent and also being developed. We were, to some degree, making it up, coming from a strong political point of view, that being the beginnings of it, the Asian American movement, its politics, what it meant, all informed the art, the culture. And so at that time, David Huang was there, a guy named Eric Hayashi. There weren't that many people that are still around doing it, and the writers were not that prominent at that time. I think I was producing a lot of work. David was producing a lot of work. I think Wakaku Yamauchi, a few other folks.
Was Frank was a playwright. Frank
Chin
was
actually
a playwright.
was like the start. He's the origin. Frank was quite the controversial figure, hard to get along with, very kind of dogmatic, and yet wrote these early brilliant plays. Chicken Coop Chinaman, Year of the Dragon, and he had a falling out at the Asian American Theater Workshop with another person there and left. And so by the time I got there, he had already gone, and I was working with all the remaining actors and producing plays and taking them around the country. I would go to East-West Players, and then Pan-Asian Rep, Northwest Asian American Theater Company, back to Asian American Theater Workshop. And what began to happen is, after a while, theater companies that are, quote, the mainstream theater companies began to take interest in my work. And David also had just begun to work at the Public Theater. And I started working with the Eureka Theater, actually. I mentioned this earlier. The Eureka Theater showed interest in my work. At that time, they were run by Oscar Eustis, Tony Taccone, I think Ellen McLaughlin was there. It was kind of a...
And Oscar goes on to run the Public Theater, and Tony the Berkeley Rep Theater.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, Oscar first went to the Taper.
To the Taper.
And then he went out to
In
run
LA.
the Public.
Yeah.
And they were examples of artistic directors who are open to the idea of being more inclusive in terms of how they wanted to program their work. So certainly at Berkeley Rep, Sharon Ott really early on took an interest in Asian American writers and work. And so gradually, the work began to be done in mainstream theaters. And then over the years, it's gained momentum and transformed the landscape. Though early on, we kept thinking, it's time now.
Yes.
It's going to change, it's going to change. And it didn't, and then we kind of also began to realize that, it's institutionalized, it's systemic in terms of what they're going to program. And that it's going to take something bigger or some other kind of momentum to change it. And now I finally feel comfortable in saying the landscape has changed in terms of Asian American playwrights, Asian American theater. They're being done everywhere. It's a new point of view that's building off of what came before, and it's impacting the whole landscape of American theater. And so for me, the idea as to having participated early on, and struggled and really wasn't sure if this was ever going to fly, to this point in time now, if I reflect back on it, it's rather remarkable that it arrived here.
What is most pressing for you now? Are there things that you're pulling through from your early work? Do you feel like you're in a new stage of work? What is calling to you?
I think I'm at this point, I would call it the third act of a 3-act play. When I started teaching 10 years ago, I thought, this is my second act of a 2-act play. But then now, 10 years down the road, I'm thinking, well, I might be leaving teaching, I'm going to retire. And what do I do with my time at this point? Especially when it's a combination of where your career is in terms of your playwriting, your art, how the world is taking to it. Also, your body. Your body is slowing down, and it's finite. So again, if I call this my third act, which I decided, I think I will, because it certainly is different than teaching, which I really enjoyed. And I enjoyed. Now I'm at a point where I kind of thought, well, what do I want to do now? And how do I want to do it? And what I've come to realize is, at this point, certain things that you do, either your body doesn't do well enough, or it can't do it in the way that allows the work to be seen and heard in the way you'd like it to be. So in terms of my career, I can say I'm at a point where my works are not getting produced,
I see.
That's simply a fact. I think the pieces are good, and they're not. And which is also part of the whole thing of why I think this Legacy Award is so important, because it kind of responds and answers to that. What I decided is I'm also a little tired of writing plays. And maybe it's a combination of all those elements, But I thought, I need to keep myself alive, my body alive creatively. And I've always loved music. And I thought, well, I've never done an opera. I should do an opera. It's working to keep whatever that thing is inside of you alive, and not burned out, and not giving up, or not treading on the same thing you did before. And then also, that idea of you have to be willing to, in order to feel alive, that you have to be willing to, as it were, step off the cliff, not knowing whether or what's going to happen, and that you hope that a landmass will appear and buoy you up. And what I found in my life is sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But it's one way when you're in those moments where you're kind of stymied and you just feel like I'm not alive doing what I'm doing. I've always done things which force you to break out of that. So that's kind of why I did my spoken word, full-length spoken word piece with the jazz ensemble of my friends from a band called Hiroshima down in Los Angeles. Really great musicians. And I said, I want to do a spoken word piece, full-length.
And you're going to perform it.
I'm going to perform it, and I've never done this before. But I did it because I'd reached a point where I was stalling out, not happy, and I thought, why don't I do something that's, again, really going to just make me step off the cliff? Of course, I do it in a really studied way. I worked with these top musicians. They were all game friends of mine. One of them scores a lot of my movies. And then Diane directed me.
Your wife?
My wife, Diane. She used to run the Asian American Theater Company. And so, you do your homework. That's the same way I did my first film. You do all your homework, and then you just kind of step off. And but it, again, by doing that, it kept me alive. It opened up sort of, again, whatever this window is, and part of a continuum, which is the legacy, as it were. This continuum of all the things you've done. You have to, at times, crack it open to make it continue to move along. And that's one of the ways I do it, and that's what I've been doing now.
That's really perfect, and such a great summary. Just a couple more things before we wrap. You are teaching. You are still teaching, though that may be the end of the second act and moving into the third. How do you communicate, whether it's values or history or bodies of work, to the younger generations, to your students? How does this journey from one act to the next, how does it feed back into the younger generation? As you said before, you were trying to form a movement. You weren't always getting the traction you wanted, but it has had an impact. What's next in terms of what you want to pass on of this legacy, or what you try to pass on?
Well, I enjoy my teaching very much so. At the same time, I believe you don't consciously work thinking it's going to in some way impact the people that come ahead of you or after you. What I've always done is you have to really pay attention to what your body gives you. And you're listening all the time to everything that's going on, feeding it, so that whatever you create and your body gives you is of the moment. In terms of how people are affected by it or look at it, you're not thinking that at the time. You just do it. It's what I continue to do. I just do it and try to, as best as possible, feed the body with as much information, as I can to keep up and not be out of sync. As far as my students now, the ones that I work with, I find we're at a very interesting time, and I initially taught playwriting through doing craft and all that. Now, I'm just interested in what is your story? Who are you? Where do you sit in your world, in the universe, at the campus? Who are you? And the students come from all over the world now. And so the idea is, what is that seed, that is you, and how are you going to grow it? So that playwriting actually is the expression of your way of life and how you figure out how to live. So ethical values, views on race, racism, ethnicity, gender, all those things are fair game and part of who you are. And if you're not aware of them, let's feed them on your own terms. And then that is your story. And then from there, we'll see what comes out.
You'll find the craft, or you'll find the form.
Yeah. Let's not go. Otherwise, it seemed backwards to me when I was doing it. I thought, people don't know what their voice is yet, or the story, And so that's what I do now with my students. And in terms of what people are doing after me that may have in some way been impacted by what I've done is wonderful, and it never was intended. And I don't really think I can add stuff to it. Rather, they took to it, and they got what they needed to get out of it, and now they're off running and creating their whole new world of their own, and I'm happy for that. And I'm also, I think, wise enough to say, let it go. I'm just going to watch.
Right.
And
I'm going to do my thing over here and watch you.
And that is good.
That's great. So last question. If you were advising your younger self, what would you say to him? And by younger, I mean at any point along the way.
What would I say to my younger self? I'm realizing I don't know. I think, again, I've lived a good life, and it's not always easy, but I've tried to be in the moment. And again, this idea of really trusting your body in terms of what it gives to you, and that knowing that it's rich with all these experiences and history and community and family and back and back and back, and that's what you have to do. It's just every day kind of create your life, make choices, ethical, everything. And that's because you've really, put your body and filled it with all that's important that you've chosen to fill it with. And then get up and meet the day. That's what I would say.